Hello class, so today we're going to cover lit reviews, RQs, data, and you. So there's going to be a lot going on in this lecture, so make sure you have all your notes and all your drinks and all that stuff ready to go, because this is going to be a bit of a ride. Okay, so let's get right to it. Literature reviews. So here's the idea. Whenever you propose a study, okay, one of the things that you have to do is you have to be able to contextualize it in terms of the academic literature. Because when you do academic research, what you're trying to do is you're trying to contribute to a conversation, okay? And that conversation is one held among other researchers. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to understand something a lot better. And to do that, then, when people are studying, let's say, dating, what you want to do is when you want to study dating, you want to try to study something that other people have not done, or if you're going to improve on an idea, you have to be able to provide a contextual justification for what it is that you're doing. So when you then publish your study, one of the first things you want to do is to be able to say, okay, so I did this study and here's how it fits in the big conversation that we're having about dating. My study is an extension of some person's previous research on such and such. You see? So you have to think of academic research then as a conversation where people are continually trying to improve ideas, responding to each other, building on ideas, and it's constantly in motion. Okay? So the literature review will do a lot of things. Okay, so just some of the things that a literature review can do. It can identify gaps in the literature. So if I'm going to like write something, I would probably put gaps in the literature. Okay, that would be one thing that a good literature review does. It might modify or replicate research. So that might be something else you might want to write. It could also extend research. So maybe like instead of replicating or trying to say like, okay, here's how one person did this study, but I want to do it a little bit differently. Maybe somebody will say, here's what this person found. Now let's try it in a new context. So like, let's say somebody studied dating among teenagers, and now you're like, huh, teenagers seem to be a lot like college students. So let's now take this exact study and let's do it with college students and see what happens. That's extending the research. Another thing you might do is you might identify key players. Okay, and when you're doing that, what you're doing is you're mentioning major studies or individuals who have a lot to say about this topic. And then another thing you might be doing as well is you're going to be using the literature to make a more nuanced argument. And the idea here is that you're going to use the literature as a way to inform what you're going to do in your study. Because if it's like, if you don't have any idea what's going on in the literature, and then suddenly, you're just kind of saying random things, or your study is too broad, or people are like, this isn't all that insightful because all this other literature is out there, that's where you start to run into problems. So the literature review is there to help you. It's to help you give a better study idea and to help you improve on the experiments that you're trying to design. But ultimately, I think the best thing that a research study can do is provide contextualization. If nothing else, think of the literature review as putting in your 2 cents in a conversation. And you're basically saying, since you said this thing earlier, since Mark said this thing earlier, here's what I'm going to do to respond. And here's where my research comes into play in this giant conversation that we're having about dating. You see? So that's what you ultimately want to be doing in research, is providing contextualization for what your study is about and what it's for. And so this is really important because the difference between like investigative journalism and academic research is this, okay? So investigative journalism, like the stuff you see on 60 Minutes, it's all cool and all, like that you're kind of studying, like, here's how the New England Patriots have came up with a team of winning, or whatever. I mean, I'm not a Patriots fan, but just example, right? So then they like go and they interview people, and they're all like, see, look at the Patriots, blah, blah, okay? But even though it's like learning, it's like this, it's helping us explore something new, it's not contributing to any kind of theoretical discussion, right? It's not trying to help our understanding of communication. It's just kind of interesting, okay? Academic research, its goal is to expand on an idea, to increase our understanding of something, and to expand theory so we can have a better practical and theoretical understanding of what communication is about. So if it doesn't exist in the literature, it doesn't exist in the academic circle, you see? So we always come back to the literature. So that's how we're different than journalism, is we're trying to expand and refine theory and trying to refine our understanding. It's not necessarily about what's entertaining, it's about what we think will be useful to achieving that goal. Okay. So we have different types of sources now. So we've looked at just kind of what the literature review is about. Now, one of the sources, which you probably would expect we'd study in this class, is scholarly sources. And scholarly sources have a double-blind peer review process prior to publication. So when I say you need to find scholarly sources, what that means is you need to have sources that have some kind of peer review to them. Now, when we say peer review, we're not talking like, oh, the grammar police looked it over and it seemed grammatically sound. When we're talking about peer review, we're talking about other experts in that field who review it and don't know it's you that wrote it. And they say, yeah, what this person is saying seems pretty legit, like based on what I know and what I've seen in my research, okay? So you'll normally find scholarly sources through special library databases. And you have access to those at Arkansas State through your library. And if you don't have, you've never been to the online library on A-State, then you need to get some help because you're going to need it for this class and you're going to need it for all of your scholarly research. So just real quick on what peer review entails then. What happens is that, let's say I do a study, okay, and I get it done, I write it up, so I do the IRB thing, I do my methods, I do all the conducting, I do all the data analysis, and I've written it up into a nice tidy 20-page paper, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a journal article and then I'm going to submit it, okay? So when you have an article, so we'll kind of like make a little thing here, and so you have the article once it's written, after you've made your study. Then it goes to the journal editor. And journals are pretty open submission, so like anybody can submit to them. Like they're not, usually don't discriminate, but the editor is going to be the first gatekeeper. And so the editors might look at it real quick, maybe just look at the abstract. He's not going to read it entirely, but they're just going to give it a look, and if it seems like it's worth their time, then the editor is going to give it to, it can vary. Some journals might just have one person, but it's going to go to at least 1 to 3 peers, okay? And the peers are going to be people who have some kind of expertise in what you've written about. And then what they're going to do is they're going to give it a rating, okay? And so when they do the rating, what they're doing is they're basically saying whether this is good enough for publication or no, okay? And they'll give you feedback and such, and they'll say like, here's why I don't think this is ready for publication, blah, blah, blah. You're crazy, blah, blah, blah. I mean, whatever. But they're going to rate it somehow. And then it's going to go back to the editor, okay? And then the editor will give you your ratings, okay? And it's possible like maybe 2 people will like your study and 1 won't. So then the editor has to make a judgment call like, so what do I think of the study? Because 2 people liked it, but 1 person didn't. So there's a little bit of editor judgment here. So that's why when you're the editor of a journal, you have all that power. But then it comes back to you, okay? And that's the idea. And then the editor will tell you one of 3 things. So there's 3 different statuses. So, you have accept as is, And that's basically, you wrote a really good paper, don't have much to improve, we'll take it, we'll publish it. Then you have something called revise and resubmit. And if you hang out with a lot of academics, they'll call it R&R. It's not rest and relaxation, it is revise and resubmit. And that is basically, we like your paper, we just need some revisions on it before we can accept it. So that's where you'll get all these people with all their different ideas about how that works or what they think it needs to be done. And then there's, of course, rejection. Okay, and then that's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so that's the peer review process. So what makes scholarly sources different is that they have this kind of review process as opposed to just Googling stuff, right? And then random idiot just kind of makes a blog and it's like, you know, vaccines cause cancer, you know, and then it's just kind of like nobody approves what this person says, and this person doesn't have to have any background. They can just say whatever they want, and there isn't anybody to be like, excuse me, like you shouldn't publish that because that's not true, you know, that kind of thing. Okay, so I guess I wrote all my stuff. Okay, so let me erase this. So here are some key databases for when you're looking for scholarly sources, and because you're going to probably have to do this, you're going to have to find some. So these are the main ones for communication. You have Communication and Mass Media Complete, Sage Premier, Academic Search Premier, and all of these are at the library. Like you can access all of these through the online library database. Google Scholar, you can access and get some articles without like a library subscription, but it's going to be limited. And when I say Google Scholar, there is actually a thing called Google Scholar. It's not Google, oh, I guess I found scholarly articles. You have to go to scholar.google.com. So a bit different. But yes, go to the A-State Library if you don't know how to do this, and they will be more than happy to teach you. And then you have popular press books. So you have scholarly sources, those are peer reviewed. And then you have popular press books. Popular press are basically books about a nonfiction topic like communication, but they're not peer reviewed. And they're usually geared towards a mainstream audience. So like Dale Carnegie stuff, like How to Win Friends and Influence People, Dale Carnegie wasn't really a scholar, it wasn't peer reviewed, but it's a great book. I mean, it's a great popular press book. It's not high in theory, but anybody can read it and understand it. So you're kind of like, how come we don't read about this person in communication studies? And it's like some celebrity. Well, it's like, because he's not scholarly, he's popular press. With that said, you can be a public intellectual if you're interested in becoming a professor someday. Where like Steven Pinker, he'll write scholarly things, but he'll also write popular press things too. So that way you can hit a mainstream audience. So it's not like one is terrible and one's awesome. It's just that this has a bit more rigor, like scholarly sources have a bit more rigor than popular press. Like anybody can do popular press if they write an interesting enough book. Not everyone can do scholarly sources because it has to be reviewed. Okay, cool. Let's talk about literature review strategies. So now you know when we say scholarly sources what we mean. Now you know where to get them. So all of those databases, take a snapshot, use those, and thrive on them. Literature review strategies. So what you want to do is you want to start with a research question or idea that you want to study, and then you want to find all the literature related to that topic. Now, in a little bit, we'll talk about how to formulate a research question and hypothesis, but for now, let's just stick to literature reviews. So let's say like, okay, I really want to study dating, okay? And let's say you found something that you really want to study. So you want to study like marriage proposals, okay? Actually, I have a friend in Canada. She's really cool, and she studies marriage proposals, and it's pretty awesome. Okay, anyways, so what you'll want to do is you'll want to look at the literature about marriage proposals. So you'll want to go to Google Scholar and type in like marriage proposals, communication. You'll want to go to Academic Search Premier, same thing, EBSCO hosts marriage proposals. It's not that hard to use the databases, just got to go there. So let's say you get like 10 articles. You find 10 really good articles about marriage proposals and communication. And so now you want to write a literature review to indicate what you're going to be doing in your study and to contextualize your study in terms of the conversation that's currently going on about marriage proposals. So there's two ways you can do that. One way is article by article. So what would happen is you would write a paper where you discuss each article in depth to make a general point about something in particular in the studies. Now, this can get a bit complicated because sometimes you might do a little bit of article by article or a little bit of what we're going to talk about next, thematic. But basically, when you do article by article, you are talking about each article in depth and exploring like what they said, how they did it. So for example, like Langley 2000 did a study where she investigated the behavior of children of single-parent households. She designed a study using such and such method. She found these key things, and what's important from this study is that she said that blah, blah, blah. So you're talking about the study in depth, and you do that with every article you found. So basically, you'd be writing 10 article summaries as you do an article by article literature review. Now, there might be reasons for doing that, like you're trying to make a general point about something. So like, let's say your study on marriage proposals, like you find 10 articles, and each of those studies has problems in them. So they don't really answer your question. So like, you have some kind of question that the research kind of answers, but you're not satisfied with the answers because each study does something differently that is messed up. Then you'll want to go article by article because you want to show like this study doesn't do it, that study doesn't do it, this study doesn't do it, that study doesn't do it. So there's reasons for doing that. The trade-off is that if you go article by article for your entire literature review, it's going to be hard to see the general points. Like, why are you going so much depth? You see what I mean? So there are reasons to go article by article, but there are also reasons not to. The other way to do it is to do it thematically. So when you do it thematically, you find common themes among a set of articles, and you group them by those themes and talk about them as a group. So instead of Langley in 2000 did blah, 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 and then Smith 2000 did blah, 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 you'll just say this. There are many studies that use interviewing as a method, and then you see all these citations here. That's all a theme. So I'm basically saying there are many studies that use interviewing as a method to study violence, and these are the studies: Smith, Vernes, Vernon, Xavier. Okay? So I grouped all of these studies by one theme, which was interviewing as a method. And there you go. I don't have to sit there and go, Smith 2000 said blah, 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 and then I have to go into Vernes, blah, 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 and then Vernon, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I know I'm making it a song, but you see what I mean? Like, you don't have to go in all that depth. And then what you're doing is the value of doing by theme is then like you're making a general extrapolation by the theme. So what we gain from using interviewing in these contexts is that we get a rich view of what people are saying. But it's not good enough for what I'm trying to do, which is blah, blah, blah. Okay? So if you're going to go thematic, the idea is that you're putting studies by themes and you're just briefly mentioning them, talking about them generally, and then using the general theme to make a point about the literature. Okay? So you will probably get to practice this. So if this is a bit abstract right now, don't worry, you'll get to practice this, you'll get to learn this, and then you will understand literature reviews. And the reason I'm teaching in this class is because you might have to do these if you haven't already, okay, in other classes. And so it's important to understand not only why people do literature reviews, but also how to do them, because you might have to do them yourself. Okay, so those are generally the two approaches. And the more acquainted you are with the literature, the more likely you're going to do something like this. But sometimes you have to do this. All right. So, and I forgot to cover something, but that's okay. So ignore this for a second. Just ignore it for a second because I forgot to put an animation there. Okay. So hypotheses and research questions. So what we want to look at is, first off, what is a hypothesis? So a hypothesis is a statement about relationships between two variables. So once you've done your literature review and you've figured out what you want to study, what you want to do next is you want to come up with hypotheses about the things that you're studying, okay? So a hypothesis is a statement about relationships between two variables. So basically, they're usually derived by theoretical propositions, okay? So what happens is you're like, okay, I want to study dating, okay? And then, you know, you do the lit review, And in the lit review, let's say there's a theory that you want to apply to a context. And let's say the theory is predictive, okay? So we're doing predictive research, okay? So post-positive. Then your hypothesis then, if you're going to apply a theory to a context, should be based on these theories' predictions. So let's say there was a theory that said, when people hit 5 years of dating, the guy usually proposes. I don't know. It's a terrible theory, but let's just say that's what it was. Okay. So let's say you're going to apply it to a new context. You're going to apply it to college students. Let's say it was only studied among older adults, but now you want to see if it's true with college students. Okay. So your hypothesis then would be that after 5 years of dating, college students will, propose after 5 years. Okay. So there are two kinds of hypotheses. So a null hypothesis states that there's no relationship between variables, or at least no significant effect. So in this example, we could say, let's say I'm studying student sex and college GPA. So we'll go on to a new example. Okay. So we can change this to GPA. Okay. And gender. We'll call it GPA and gender. So the null hypothesis is basically the hypothesis that you're trying to disprove. So when I'm trying to predict things, okay, the idea is that everything is based on causality, right? Or that at least a relationship between two variables. So if I'm doing GPA and gender, I want to see if your gender has an effect on whether you have a high GPA or not. Then the null hypothesis would be there is no relationship between a student's sex and college GPA. Okay, we can say sex instead of gender, either way. And so by default, whenever I'm going to make a predictive statement about something, there's always a null hypothesis that I'm trying to disprove. So by the fact that I've said, I suspect that there's some kind of relationship between GPA and gender, there is necessarily a null hypothesis that says there is no such relationship. And the reason that there is necessarily a null hypothesis is because researchers are generally conservative, okay? So we just kind of assume that if there's a relationship between anything, it's by chance until you prove otherwise. You see what I mean? So the burden of proof is on the researcher to suggest that any relationships that you're talking about between GPA and gender, GPA and sports activity, anything that you suggest is not by is purely by luck until you prove otherwise. It's kind of like innocent till proven guilty, okay? So that's how we roll with statistics. There is no relationship until you prove otherwise. So the research hypothesis then will propose that there is a relationship between an independent and dependent variable, okay? So that's where this comes into play. So my hypothesis might actually be female college students have higher GPAs than male college students, okay? So that's a directional hypothesis. So a directional hypothesis is one that says something has a relationship in one way or in a different way. So like female college students have higher GPAs than male college students. That means like females will have the edge. It can go the other way too. I could say male college students will have a higher GPA than female college students, and it's just directional going the other direction. A non-directional research hypothesis is one where I don't say either way. I just say there is a difference between college GPAs of male and female students, but I don't indicate who has the higher one. So this hypothesis is, I want to say weaker, but not weaker in terms of like not as effective, but just weaker in the sense that like it's making a weaker claim. Just that there is some relationship. I'm not saying girls are better than guys or guys are better than girls at college. I'm just saying that there is some relationship that I suspect, and I just don't know which way it's going to go. This one is a bit of a stronger assertion, if you will, or a stronger claim because you're saying one is going to be better than the other. You see what I mean? So that has more certainty to it. This one has a little bit less certainty because it's just like, I don't know. There's some difference. There's some relationship. I don't know which way, but it's there. This one is, no, there is a relationship and it goes this way. You see what I mean? So when I'm trying to predict things or kind of say like there's a relationship between two things, especially with a hypothesis, there's always going to be a null no matter what. Okay, and I'm always trying to disprove it. And H0 always stands for the null hypothesis. So if you notice the 0 subscript, that's every time you see that, that's the null hypothesis. That's what the researcher's trying to disprove. And then what the researcher's trying to prove is their research hypothesis, that female college students have higher GPAs than male college students, or there's a difference between college GPAs of male or female students. Okay, so you always have both in predictive studies. So another thing about hypotheses too, before we move on, a good hypothesis will have a couple of things. Number one, a hypothesis is always a statement. Okay, notice that statement is underlined and bolded. It's not a question. Okay, we're going to get to research questions in a second. So anytime I say make a hypothesis, I'm saying make a statement, like make a prediction, and it comes with a period at the end. Okay, and it should always posit some kind of expected relationship between two variables. So when we say independent variable and dependent variable, what we mean is independent is the variable that affects the dependent. I mean, that's one way of putting it. I know it's kind of dangerous to put it that way. So like GPA will be a dependent variable because you're asking, does gender affect GPA, right, in some way? Or if we change gender, does GPA get affected as a result, is a better way to put it, okay? You might think like independent might be diet, and then dependent might be weight. So diet is the result of weight, or weight is the result of diet, I mean. So if we change your diet, does your weight change? So independent is the thing that we're messing with. The dependent is kind of like the result or outcome that we want to see whether it's affected or not. At least that's a good enough way to put it. Okay? And then the other thing about hypotheses is that they should be based on the literature. So remember, you should derive your hypotheses from what you've read in the literature review. So there is no relationship between a student's sex and college GPA. That's the null. This should have some kind of basis from what you've read in the literature. Okay? So that's where the literature comes in. And the last thing is hypotheses have to be testable. So hypotheses have to be testable, meaning there has to be a way to verify whether this is true or false based on our senses, okay, based in empiricism. So testable, empirical. Empirical means it can be verified with the senses. If you don't like that science is very much based in the senses, and it's like, what about alternative realities, you know, or all that? What about ghosts and spirits? You know, like science isn't going to help you, right? Like then you're not going to like science, because science is all about what we can see, taste, touch, and feel, right? Now, that comes with philosophical assumptions, of course, and you can certainly take a philosophy class like epistemology or philosophy of social science where you can kind of explore like the problems with those assumptions or the glories of those assumptions, either way, whichever way you go. But that's the paradigm, like the grand paradigm that we're operating in when we're dealing with science. It has to be testable, empirical. That's the idea. Okay, enough about hypotheses. Now we're on to research questions. See, there's only one. Okay. Oh, that's nice. I just hit it in the phrase. Okay, good. So research questions. So research questions are questions about proposed relationships between variables. So research questions are generally open-ended. Okay. So they're usually written to explore processes or to understand a behavior, to discover meaning, describe experiences. So look at this example. Is there a difference between the college GPAs of men and women? So that would be a research question. It's open-ended, yes or no. Another research question might be, how do men perceive academics, or something like that, or perceive school. I know that's not the best written, but how is kind of like, I don't know. It's open-ended. You see what I mean? So this would be more of a closed-ended research question, and this would be more open-ended. But generally, you want research questions to be open-ended if possible. Because another thing, if you notice, like, how is this research question different than this one? Well, this is a research question and that's a hypothesis. Okay, but why does that matter? Well, the reason it matters is what generally, when it comes to interpretive versus post-positive research, remember, post-positive research is about prediction. So this is a deduction based on the literature that you're trying to figure out if there is some kind of relationship between two things. If you're interpretive, this is about exploring a world, right? And so you're not necessarily verifying a theory or confirming a theory, you're exploring, you're remaining open-minded. And so it's kind of like a difference in tenor in terms of what's important to you, okay? So you won't see this in interpretive research for the most part. Like all of this is mostly post-positive. And in fact, all of this is pretty much post-positive. This you'll see in interpretive mostly. You might see a little bit of this in post-positive too, in some studies, but a lot of this is interpretive. So we'll put PP here for post-positive. Oh, PP, okay, and interpretive, because it's just a different angle of wanting to discover something. Make sense? So no, I know it's hard, like not seeing students. So I'm trying to imagine students like nodding their heads. Yes, it makes sense. Okay, good. All right. Oh, one more thing. Let me go back. Okay, I don't think it lets me go back. Okay, a good research question should of course be a question, and it should give focus to your study based on the literature, and it should also only be a sentence or two. Like both hypotheses and research questions should only be about a sentence or two at most, and it has to be testable. So even if you're doing interpretive, it still has to be something that we can see, touch, say, all five senses. Okay, now we're on to data and sites. So now you're like, okay, so I have this thing that I'm interested in. I've read the research. I now have research questions. Great, cool. So now the next thing you want to do is you want to get data, okay? Because this is not the world of speculation. This is not your MySpace blog where you can just rant about things. It's not Facebook where you can just make a meme of whatever you want and then share it to 1,000 people, and then suddenly now it's science, okay? So this is actually like, now you have to get data and prove whatever it is, or discover whatever it is that you're interested in. Okay, so data is information that's been collected in a systematic manner. Okay, so people will always ask about this. Is data singular or plural? Okay, so data is technically plural if you want to get all technical about it. And then of course datum is singular. So like datum is singular. So this is not an error. This is like technically how data is said. The problem is everybody treats data like it's singular. So that's why it's all confusing. Okay. Brief side note. All right, let me hit that erase button. See, I just discovered this erase button. That's pretty good. Okay. So anyways, that's data. So it's systematic. That's the key. If you're going to get data for anything, you have to be systematic about how you get it and how you analyze it. And we're not on analysis today, like that's going to come later. But the idea is just that you have to be systematic. Whatever you do in a study, you got to be systematic because you got to be able to explain to people what you did. And we'll talk about that why later. Okay, so let's see. There's 3 different kinds of data. So the first kind are texts, texts. So texts are written, spoken, performed, or symbolic messages. So you're basically looking at things that are written down or were transcribed, okay? So like if I was interviewing somebody, I would probably transcribe it to make it written, and then I would analyze it that way. Now, quantitatively, you can study text through something called content analysis. So if we wanted to like branch this off, quant, usually you do something like content analysis. Now, I'm not going to have time to go through, because this lecture is already long enough as it is. But content analysis is basically counting the frequency of something. And then qualitative is qualitatively, you might do something like discourse analysis, okay? And you'll learn what some of these are later in the course. Then you have observations. So if it's not written anywhere, like in an archive, or it's not a transcription of something, or it's not messages that have been produced or whatever, then one thing you can do is you can observe it. So this is data that you get by watching or recording human action. So, anything that you can see as it's happening will be observation. So quantitatively, you might look at repetitions or behaviors in an experiment. So we might watch how people act in a lab and then, count something like, here's how many times this person showed a passive aggressive gesture during the puzzle solving exercise, something like that. Qualitatively, we might do something called ethnography. Okay, so quantitatively, experimental counting, qualitatively, and we're going to learn a little bit about this, ethnography. Ethnography is where you go out into the field and you observe people in their natural habitats. So basically, what anthropologists do is essentially ethnography. They go out into the field, they live with the natives, and they record what they observe. And then lastly, you have testimony. And testimony, and I'm just moving this, so just rewind if you need that again. Okay, testimony is data that's acquired by what participants tell you. Okay, so if I can't find any records of you doing stuff, if I can't watch you doing stuff, then my only other way of getting data from you is asking you, like, about stuff you do. So, for example, we might, to study cheating, I probably am not going to find any records of people cheating. Like, I'm going to record and transcribe my conversations with my mistress, right? Like, nobody's going to do that. No one's going to be like, yes, researcher, I'll let you follow me and watch me cheat. Okay, so you're not going to be able to observe. So the only thing you can really do is ask people about their cheating habits. So there's two ways of doing that. Self-reporting. So self-reporting is where I create a survey if I'm quantitative, or maybe I conduct an interview if I'm qualitative, and I ask you about your cheating habits, and you report, yeah, I've cheated 5 times. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying, like, that's what a person might say, and then, get into that. Or you can do other reporting, and other reporting is where I ask somebody else about your behaviors. So I might ask, I don't know, if you're like dating somebody, I might ask your partner, does your partner cheat? And of course, that's probably not a good question to ask, because like they're probably not going to know. And then of course, if you're asking them, that's going to cause suspicion. So maybe not the best study to do other reporting, but like something like how often does your partner hit you might be something like, if you're studying domestic violence, other reporting would probably be correct, because of course the person who's self-reporting is probably going to underestimate that, versus somebody who's other reporting will probably be maybe more accurate. I mean, I don't know their motives, but like, you see what I mean? You can see the issues there. So these are pretty much the 3 kinds of data. I mean, anything that's produced out of social science usually comes out of one of these 3 things. And I went to a lecture at Cambridge when I studied abroad there, and somebody did a plenary lecture on, the guy was arguing, he was a philosophy guy, and he was arguing that all knowledge is some form of testimony, which I thought was interesting. I think personal experience wouldn't count, but yeah, I mean, a lot of things that you've learned, you were learned because somebody told you that, not necessarily because you learned it, like you experienced it yourself. You know what I mean? So very interesting idea, and take a philosophy class if you want to explore more. Okay, then we're on to sites. So sites are where you get data from. I don't know why I put might. Why did I put might? You get data from sites. Okay, so I'm just going to cross that out. So booyah. Okay, so you can get text, observations, or testimony from 3 different places. You can do archival research. So this is where you might go, or you will go, somewhere where records and documents are stored. So eventually I'm going to do a study on police interrogations, and if I can't watch them, I can get transcriptions of them from apparently certain places, I'm told. So from the police department, so I guess they're releasable. I don't know. I'm going to figure it out. But that's archival research. Like, I'm going to go to an archive where all these things are, and I'm going to study it. Historians do a lot of archival research. One of my friends in grad school was an art history major, and part of her job was to go to different libraries in Chicago, New York, just to go to their libraries because they have certain things there related to her history, and she got to travel the world to go to their library. So pretty cool if you like libraries. All right. Field research is where you go where communication's taking place. So you basically go where, the native's habitat is, or let's say I want to study bullying. So if I might do an experiment where like maybe I can see kids bullying each other. Maybe I'll set up some kind of little design where kids will like be playing and then one will start shoving another or so forth. I don't know if that'd be ethical, so that's IRB stuff, but like, maybe. Another way to do it is just go to a elementary school during recess and observe kids at recess. That's field research. So I'm going to their location and I'm making my observations there. And then laboratory research. This is where the researcher brings them to a lab where everything is controlled so they can focus on the particular thing being studied. So you would create an environment that's controlled, that has cameras and all that stuff, so you can conduct your observations. So 3 different sites where you can get your data from. Okay, now we're on to sampling. And sampling is where, let me get the next thing. Well, first, sampling, when you're going to get people part of a study, the first thing you have to figure out is who are you studying? Who are you studying? So you're first off going to be interested in a population. Okay, so a population is a general group of people or demographic that you're interested in. So if we went back to the whole gender and GPA question, our population would be college students, right? Because we're asking about how people perform in college, then your population is going to be college students. So then you might define your population then as people currently enrolled in college, okay? So that's the general population. Your sample then will be the group of people who are particular people who are participating in your study. So I might be interested in gender and GPA. So what I might do is I might randomly select 100 college students from Arkansas State University. So those 100 college students would be my sample, and they would be representing the population of college students. Okay? So the sample are the people you actually study. The population is the people that you're interested in. So the sample should reflect the population. Now, there's 2 kinds of sampling. The first kind of sampling is random sampling. And this is where everyone in the population has an equal chance of being selected. So how this might happen is you might, let's say you wanted to sample Arkansas State University, you would have to get a list of all of the college students that go to Arkansas State University, which I think is feasible. I think there's some list out there. And you probably have to randomly select maybe every 5th person. For example, maybe that's how you're going to randomly select, your college students. So then you would select every 5th person on the list, and then you'd email them and say, hey, you want to participate in a study? You're the 5th person. You're the every 5th person, something like that. You might do some researchers, and they pay a lot of money for this. You get a random number generator, and the random number generator will just generate random numbers, and then you select people based on the number assigned to them. So there's that way too. But random means everybody has an equal chance of being selected to being in the study. And then non-random is the opposite, where people don't have a chance not everyone has an equal chance of being in the study. So here's why this is important. A random sample is the best kind of sample to get because that's what partially allows you to generalize your sample to your population. So what we'll learn later is that the reason you can say, based on 100 college students, here's what most college students do, like you generalize from a sample to a population, or if you notice in the politics right now, we did a polling sample of 1,000 Americans, and it looks like Donald Trump is winning, and they can say Donald Trump is popular in America based on 1,000, partially because of random sampling, because the idea is that if I randomly choose enough people out of a population, they should necessarily reflect the makeup of the population, and as long as it's random, that's pretty much, it's a mirror image of what the population would do. It's also based on a theory. So it's one is random. Second is central limit theorem. And we're not going to talk about that today, but we will later in the course. Oops, theorem. Theorem. Okay. Here's how you spell theorem, everybody. I'm going to tell you how to spell it. Okay, so T-H-E-O-R-E-M. Okay? So don't worry about central limit theorem right now. Just chill. Be like, okay, it's all good. Okay? But if something is truly random, you can then generalize. If something isn't randomly selected, so if I pick like just a bad batch, you know, or if I'm just like, I'm just going to pick the last 5 people on the list, you start to run into problems with generalizability, because we don't know if you got an accurate representation of the population because the way you picked your representation was biased. Does that make sense? So you have to pick your representation in a way that's fair, otherwise it's not going to be reflective of the true population. It's kind of like if the population has cats and dogs, and you're like, okay, I want to study how pets interact with plants, but I hate dogs, so I'm just going to do cats. But then I'm going to say that this is what all pets do. That's a problem, right? Like you didn't pick a reflective population because your sample doesn't reflect your population. Excuse me, you didn't pick a reflective sample. Your population has dogs in it. Your sample doesn't have any dogs in it. So you can't say that your sample represents all pets because it doesn't have dogs in it. Does that make sense? So that's what we mean. Now, there's other ways to do non-random sampling. So there's actually 4 ways. So I'm going to talk about these briefly. So you have convenience sampling, and this is something you'll see very often in college campuses. Convenience sampling is where you base your data on ease of accessibility rather than randomness. So a lot of researchers, and this is a problem, a lot of researchers will say, I need to get 500 participants in this survey study, so I'm just going to have college students take them, okay? Because they're easy to get, they'll do anything for $15 compensation, and you know, it's just easy, right? The problem is then you have all this research based on college students, but not all college students communicate the same way as, like, say, older adults or teenagers or adolescents or little kids. So that's a problem, right? So, but it's sometimes necessary. Like, we don't have any other way of getting data. The problem is random samples are hard to get. Like, it's hard to get a full list of something and then being able to get everyone to participate. Like, it's hard. It's hard. So convenience is kind of like the easy response, right? Like, let's then just get what we can, okay? Snowball sampling is essentially, so like if I were to summarize convenience sampling, I just put ease. This is what I would say referrals. So a snowball sample is where I get like 1 or 2 people to participate in the study. And then I'm like, if you know anybody else who qualifies for the study, please send them over. And then they get other people to participate in the study, and the sample basically snowballs, okay? So there are reasons where you might want to do that. For example, if you're dealing with like drug addicts, for example, like a very marginalized population where it's like, you know, you can't just put out a poster. If you're a drug addict and you want to come learn, you know, and you want to participate in a study for $25, come to my office. Like, you know, people aren't going to show up. Like, you know what I mean? So you might use a snowball sample where it's like, you just find 1 or 2 people who are drug addicts, and you just say, hey, if you have any friends, I know that it's going to be hard for them to come out, but like, if you have any friends that you know who are also suffering from this problem, you know, have them call me and they can participate. So then, since they have a network, they know people, they can bring you people. So sometimes it's necessary. Then you have purposive sampling, and this is where you're focusing on a specific group as the exclusion of other groups. So it's very specific. So let's say I want to study hockey, like I want to know how athletes handle academic stress, but I just want to limit it to football players because I'm really interested in, because football is basically year-round. Like, no, they got a season off, they got 2 months, yeah, but they have to do stuff like during that time. You know, I want to know how they deal with it. So I'm going to exclude basketball players, for example. I'm going to exclude softball. I'm going to exclude rugby, okay? So that's purposive sampling, okay? So I'm limiting my sample to only a particular group of people. And then you have quota sampling, and you basically have predetermined numbers that you try to get in categories. And you try to fill those categories and numbers. And so, you know, the predetermined numbers might try to reflect randomness, but a lot of times they may not. Okay, so that's that. Now, defining variables, okay? Let's see. So first, when you define a variable, this is like the thing that you're interested in, okay? And so like with GPA and gender, that one's kind of easy because it's easy to define gender, and then GPA is pretty easy to define. But like, let's say you want to study relationship initiation, so how people first start talking to each other, then you might have to define it. You have to define what relationship initiation is. Or let's use violence, since I already have this example out. So there are two kinds of definitions. You have conceptual, okay? And conceptual definitions are basically your average dictionary definition of things. So example, violence is when an individual physically hurts another individual out of malicious intent. I made that definition, so give me a pat on the back. All right. Okay. So that's conceptual, you know, and when you start doing research, like you probably start with a conceptual definition, right? Because you just don't know everything yet. But then once you've started to come up with the design, then you need to have a better definition than this. Because this definition, as you can tell, it's not easy to quantify or measure anything based on this. Like, what would you measure? Or how would you define physically hurt? Or how would you define malicious intent? So forth. So that's where you got to come up with an operational definition. When this is where you define concepts and labels by the way they are measured. So let's say I was going to do a study where I was going to look at violence in terms of crime committed. Okay, crimes committed. Then I would redefine violence as violence is the number of reported cases of assault, stabbings, shootings, and arsons in a community. So maybe my study is like police presence and violence. Do the presence of cop cars within 500 feet of, you know, poor neighborhoods decrease the presence of violence. Okay, so I'd have to define police presence too, and I'd have to define that in a quantitative way. So that's what I kind of tried to do on the fly. But if we're just focusing on violence, I'll say violence is the number of reported cases of assault, stabbing, shootings, and arsons in the community. What that does is that helps me quantify violence, and it helps me define it. So then there's no question of, well, how did you define violence, and how did you know violence was there, and how did you know violence was there? Well, if it was reported as such and such, I'm going to assume that there was something there, okay? Now, this definition is not perfect, right? So you can then dispute the definition. So that's one way you can critique studies. Well, is how did you define this? Because obviously a glaring problem would be if I were to actually use this, which I wouldn't, but if I were to use this, what about unreported cases? What about all the times, you know, somebody gets bullied and doesn't say anything? Like, your number would probably be too small, right? And then, of course, you have, like, fake reportings. Like, what if he hit me in the hand, you know, like, and it's just not a big deal. You know, then you have that issue as well. So this is always a place where you can critique studies. It's just, how did you define this thing? Because that's a whole, like, ball of wax in itself. So something to think about. Okay. So whatever it is that you want to study, you got to have a conceptual definition, and you got to have a way to define it in a way that it's measurable. We can then measure what it is that you're studying. If this is what you provide as a definition for a study, that's a problem, okay? Because like then it's like too vague, okay? You have to be, when you're dealing with empirical research, everything needs to be down to the empirics, not in abstract land, okay? It has to be empirical, okay? Now, this is an important piece, okay? And, you know, people will get lost, so follow this slide very closely, okay? I'm going to try my best to explain these next 4 things because it can get confusing, and, you know, and feel free to ask questions if you're still confused by the end of it. But I have to explain this. You cannot graduate a research methods class without understanding these 4 things. Okay. So let's say you have your variable of violence, okay, or whatever, you know. There's 4 ways or 4 kinds of variables that you could potentially use, okay? So it could be violence, it could be income, it could be, you know, any kind of thing that you want to study. They can come in 4 different ways. Like it can count as 4 different kinds of variables. So a nominal variable is a variable that is mutually exclusive non-numeric categories. Okay, so I know it's like a little bit of a mouthful. Basically, a nominal variable is like male or female. What color is your hair? Brown, black, blonde, red, strawberry blonde? So nominal variables are categories, like non-numeric categories. That's what you have to remember. So like hair color, you know, favorite team, you know, anything that's just a category and it's not in any kind of hierarchy. So like hair color isn't like, you know, blonde is better than brown. So, oh man, that person put brown, man, you know, that person has a problem. No, it's like each category is on an equal plane. Okay, so like non-numeric categories and everything is equal. Like it's not, one isn't better than the other. It's just a category, if you will. Race is a nominal category. Okay, it isn't like it's not the Nazi time or anything like that. You know, we're not in segregation where it's like, you know, like white and black and like, oh, you know, you got to pick the right answer because, you know, or whatever. So it's nominal. Everything is equal. Okay, so that's easy enough. Now you have ordinal data. And so I have to try to explain this. This is data where, or a variable that has data that is rank ordered with inconsistent distance between each ranking. So like, think of movie ratings, okay? So I'm going to make a little line here just to kind of show this. And let's say this is 1 star, and then this is 2 star. I'll just put stars here. Okay. Actually, before I even do that, so erase that because I don't want to create confusion. I'll do it this way. A movie, let's say a movie is given 5 stars. So, okay, so just pretend that this is a star, you know. Okay, it got 5 stars. Okay, we get it. The movie must be pretty good, right? I mean, getting 5 stars is, of course, better than getting 1 star, right? Like, if somebody's like, I got a 1-star movie, oh, that's a crappy movie. But if it's like 5 stars, oh, it must be pretty good, right? Okay, so the stars then are an ordinal variable. Like, there is a rank ordering where like one is higher than another. Does that make sense? Unlike check your race, there isn't like, oh, white's up here, you know, white is 5 and black is 1 or anything like that. No, it's all equal when it comes to those kinds of things because it's a nominal variable. So like there's some kind of ordering here. Now here's the thing you have to understand. So I have to try to explain this as best I can. What would the difference be between a 4-star and a 5-star movie? Really? You know, because here's the thing, right? Like the difference between like a 1-star and a 2-star movie, can you really quantify or define the clear difference between a 1-star and 2-star movie? I mean, it could be that the difference between a 1-star and a 2-star movie is like this. It's like this little gap. And then the difference between a 2-star and a 3-star movie could be like this. And then the difference between a 4-star and a 5-star movie, maybe it's like this. Like there's like a really big gap, like, and then like maybe like a small gap between 4 and 5. You see? So the problem is that with star ratings, we can say like, well, the difference between 3 stars and 5 stars is 2 stars. But what's a star, right? Like, and how do you conceptualize the difference between a 4-star and a 3-star and a 2-star and a 1-star. Because it could be something like this, where like pretty much everybody gets 2 stars because like your movie has to really suck to like get 1 star. But to get a 3-star, you got to work really hard to like get that. And to even get 4-star, I mean, you got to have like, I mean, Johnny Depp's got to be in it, and Jared Leto's got to be in it, and he's got to be the Joker. And then like 5-star, like, you know, there's got to be like massive blowing up, or I don't know, whatever. And so the gaps between are not consistent. Does that make sense? So like one gap here is and then one gap's kind of big, this gaps and this, you know, and part of that gapping comes from sort of and I want to say arbitrariness of it. Okay? There's a sort of arbitrariness to the 5 to the 4 to the 3 to the 2 to the 1. Okay? So we know that 5 stars is better than 1 star, but we couldn't really tell you consistently that there's a consistent difference between 4, 5, 3, 2, and 1. It just depends on the viewer, okay? And if you look at customer ratings of an event, of something on Amazon, right? So like, you know, you go on Amazon.com and you're like, it's got 5 stars, it's gonna be a good product, you know? But then somebody's like, you know, you look at another product and it's like, this one's got 3 stars. So that means the 5-star product is a little bit less than twice as better than the 3-star. Okay. With ordinal data, that's not necessarily true, because a 4-star rating and a 5-star rating and 2-star rating, you know, people might have different thresholds for what is a 2 and what is a 3 and what is a 4. You see what I mean? There's not equal distance between the 1, the 2, the 3, and the 4 because it's so arbitrary, right? Like there's kind of an arbitrariness to it, and it's not quite clear what the difference is. So things like, you know, best and worst, highest and lowest, like what was your best memory? Like who is your best friend? Like you don't really have like a system where it's like maybe that consistent. It's just kind of like, I think this one's my best friend, but it could be that one. Like it could be my 4. Like there's sort of an arbitrariness to it, and it's not equal. That's the thing you have to remember about ordinal data. Now, the next is interval data. So ordinal is like nominal, except the data are rank ordered, and there's inconsistent distance between the ranking. So ordinal is like nominal in the sense that the data, there is data, but they're rank ordered. Interval is like ordinal, except that the data are rank ordered and there is consistent distance between each ranking. Okay? So interval data, there is consistent distance. So an example of interval data would be temperature, right? So the difference between 30 and 31 degrees is like one, you know, the mercury thing going all the way up to 31. The difference between 29 and 30 is the same thing. You see, whatever the thermometer says, like it's going to be the same between 30, 31, and 32. Okay? Another difference, so let me change the numbers here so you can see something. With interval data, the 0 degrees is still a possibility. Okay? Like with interval data, there is no such thing as absence of something. So like there's like even when it's 0 degrees out, that's still a temperature, right? And then you can have 1 and then you can have 2. And in fact, we can go to -1 with interval data, right? Because you can say like 0 is just another degree, -1 is also a degree too. And then we can say it's still 2 degrees warmer than 0 and it's equal between the intervals. So you know, this would be interval. Okay? There is, you know, an interval. There is a rank order, but they're all equal. Lastly, and then I don't know if I have enough space, so I'll have to see how this comes out. You have something called ratio data. And ratio is like interval, except 0 means absence. So what that means is it's possible to have a 0 value. and that 0 would mean absence. For example, you can have 0 sexual partners, right? Like 0 isn't like a figurative number where it's like, well, I had sex with this one guy, but he wasn't a real person. Like he was a jerk, so I'm just gonna say 0. Like, no, I mean like 0 means like you've had 0, right? Or you can have $0 in salary, right? So that would be a ratio variable. 0 means the absence, okay? So ratio is usually questions about like how many of this has happened, and 0 would mean absent. So ratio, 0 means 0, okay? And then you usually go, and everything is equal in between as well. All right, so interval, 0 is still presence of something. Ratio, 0 means absence of something, And that's how they all relate. So now you're probably wondering, why? Like, why do we have to have this? Here's why this matters, okay? Number one, think of nominal data. So you wouldn't take an average hair color. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like I'm going to take the average of brown, brunette, blonde, and redhead, and I'm going to come up with an average. Like that doesn't make sense because it's nominal data. Like how do you do that? It's not a number. It's not real. See what I mean? Okay. Ordinal data, because of these inconsistencies that are in between the numbers, you can't take an average of ordinal data. Like if you take an average of ordinal data, your average is going to be skewed because the numbers don't have equal weight, you see? So you're going to have a biased average, you see, because if by default most movies get 3 stars just by default, or 2 stars by default just for being a movie, then like 3 loses its value, right? Because the difference between 1 and 2, most people get 2 points automatically. There's going to be some kind of inflation going on, you see? So inflation is going to be happening here because the gap between 1 and 2 isn't that big, and it's not as big as the gaps between 3 and 4, and 4 and 5 isn't that big. You see? So ordinal data, you can't really average, okay? You're not supposed to average anyways. What you're supposed to do with nominal and ordinal data is frequency. You can calculate frequency of something. So you might look at frequency of 5-star ratings. You might look at frequency of 4-star ratings, but an average wouldn't make any sense. So when you look at Amazon.com, for example, they're actually kind of right. They don't average, well, I don't think, do they average the rating? Actually, they do, so they're wrong. But like you can look at their ratings based on number of 5-star ratings, number of 4-star ratings, number of 3-star ratings. That's actually more accurate because this is ordinal data. Does that make sense? Interval and ratio data, the important difference here is if you're going to measure magnitude of something, ratio is better because you can have 0 of something. Like you can have a 0 result. With interval, 0 still means something is present, like something is still there. It's just another number on an interval scale, and there could be maybe a negative of it. Does that make sense? Like you can't have negative salary with interval data. But you can with ratio, you can have 0, right? Like I don't think an interval, I mean, I guess you have negative salary if you like cost money. Like if your existence is like, I don't know, like costing, well, I guess that, well, but I don't want to get too philosophical, but still, ratio is kind of the best when you're trying to look at magnitude or differences between things, okay? But for both of these, we could still use average and standard deviation. It's just harder to make comparisons between interval data because 0 counts as something versus ratio where 0 means an absence. Okay? So this is important. Like if you take any other research methods class, like they're going to bring this up. And if I explain this well enough, you will understand now why this is important. It has mathematical implications for what you can do with the data and how you make sense of the data. So understand this. Watch this slide again if you have to, like hit the rewind button, like ask questions, call me, email me, Facebook me, Twitter me. I have all that stuff on the syllabus, and let's get this taken care of if you do not understand it. Amen. Okay. Now, there are two common measures that also you need to be aware of. So one of them is the Likert scale. So the Likert scale is when you take a survey, for example, you're provided a list of statements to agree or disagree with. Now, when you take customer service exit surveys, usually they're in this way. They're like, the customer service rep was polite and friendly to me. Strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, you know? So those are Likert scales. They're basically giving you statements and you are allowed to agree, disagree, strongly disagree, and so forth, okay? So these are a list of statements to agree or disagree with. So you will see this often in the measurement of attitudes. So in self-reports, and now this is all coming together now, self-report studies, okay, Likert scales will come into play, or testimony, or other report too could be true as well. But usually, you know, attitudes, behaviors, I mean, usually attitudes is what these are best for, but you can use them to also measure behaviors. I frequently talk to my partner on the phone, you know, strongly agree, disagree, so forth. Then you have the semantic differential scales. And these are usually to measure attitudes and abstract ideas. And what happens is you use polar opposite adjectives and adverbs to indicate how you feel about something. So like, rate the public service announcement according to the scale below. Unique, common, and then you just be like, 6. Okay, good. So you thought it was pretty common. Okay, and then next one, you know, other thing, circle, 5. Okay, cool. Okay, so both of these are very common in communication research, and so that's why I wanted to show you this. I also wanted to bring this up because going back to the previous slide, okay, so are Likert scales ordinal or interval data? So your book was all like, oh, it's interval data, but I'm like, oh no, man, it's ordinal. So, because here's my argument, okay? I don't think like, so going back to the little number line here, okay? Strongly agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. I don't think there's like an even gap between these. I think it's very arbitrary sometimes how we decide like if we agree with something versus strongly disagree with something, or like strongly agree. Like if I'm pissed off about something, like I don't know, like about customer service, I don't know, it sucks. Like I don't know, disagree, like strongly disagree, but then you kind of have like, well, it sucked, but I don't know if it sucked that bad. But you know, I feel like I mean, people are kind of arbitrary about this. But then I went on to this like research site thing and ResearchGate, where all these academics come together, and there was a huge like discussion about this, and like all these statistics professors were on there, and then like some dude from Harvard, like from Harvard statistics department, like posted on there, and he's like, dude, it's ordinal, but then other people are like, no, it's interval, and it got really statistical, and I understood most of it, but apparently it just depends on what you do with it. Is the end of the day kind of question with both of these. And it's kind of a little bit beyond the scope of our class in terms of the answer to that, but I tend to think it's ordinal, but people will disagree with me on that, okay? And the little statistics professor from Harvard, I mean, it was pretty interesting to watch. I was like, I should have my students watch this, but I think you guys are getting tortured enough as it is. So and then I'd have people like, my forums would probably be exploding like, I don't get it, you know, that kind of stuff, and then people want to drop the class and whatever. Okay, so that's that. Okay, lastly, and then we're done. Evaluating research. So basically, we're going to cover these a little bit more in depth as we get more in depth on these things, because like right now we're still kind of like in an overview mode of just research in general, but then starting next week we're going to really start covering quantitative, and then in the second half of the course we're going to cover qualitative. But just to kind of get these ideas planted, validity is all about, are you actually talking about the thing that you're trying to talk about? So like internal validity would be like, does your study actually study the thing that you're trying to study? Okay, so I use study in 3 times in one sentence, but it makes sense. So like you might think you're studying violence when in fact you're studying like the effects of poverty based on the way your study is designed. Like you haven't accounted for the fact that maybe this is all about poverty, not really violence. Okay, so that's internal validity. External validity is where, is your study applicable to the real world, if you will? Is it generalizable to the general population that you're trying to talk about? So here's the thing. You might have a very well-designed, controlled study that can control for everything and create this laboratory environment where like everything is just controlled, right? And so you'll have a lot of internal validity. But the problem is that it trades off with external validity, because who lives in a lab, right? Who interacts in a lab all day, right? Most people, they interact in a world that has all kinds of random variables and effects and all of that stuff. So it's not super externally valid, because how many people have conversations about their future next 5 years in a lab with 2 people watching them on camera and you know, getting paid $15 to participate, right? Like, that's the problem with external validity. Now, if you really want to get deep into this, like some people would even argue, would go even further to say that science doesn't even really talk about the real world. Science talks about the world in terms of a controlled environment, which isn't the real world, but is just an environment, if you will. But I don't want to get too deep because it's already running long. Okay. Then you have reliability. Reliability is all about the results are consistent and they're not due to error or chance. So basically, we can replicate these results and we can see that they are talking about what they're supposed to talk about. Generalizability is all about, can this be true of the population? So going back to having a random sample, okay? And we have enough statistical power. So you have to have a large enough sample. So large and random sample. And then parsimony, the results are detailed and they don't include anything we don't need. So quantitative methods, by the way, are usually post-positive. Qualitative methods are usually interpretive, critical, okay? It's a statistical relationship, not a necessary one. Post-positive can use quantitative methods, but they're going to use it a little bit differently. Interpretive can use quantitative methods, but they're probably going to do like basic statistics, not predictive stuff. So, and then critical theorists can go either way, technically, but a lot of them are qualitative. I've seen critical quantitative studies, and they're actually pretty interesting. So, but that's kind of, once again, where paradigms start to come into play. Okay, qualitative. So they're going to measure their studies differently, because remember, quantitative, you know, post-positive, you're trying to predict, right? Here, you're trying to understand. So you're going to measure your studies differently, because you're not going to say, like, I'm trying to predict too. No, you're not. You're trying to understand. Okay, so credibility, does the data truly reflect what the subjects believe? So this is making sure that whatever data you collected through interviews, through observations, whatever, that they actually reflect what the subjects believe. So there's a couple of methods that you can use to do that we'll discuss later, but you have to be able to establish that this isn't just your opinion, like this is truly what you acquired through your studies with the native population. Transferability is all about that the findings are written in a way to where they can be applied in other contexts, at least as working hypotheses. So basically, you've provided enough information and enough findings, and you've provided them in a way where I can maybe take your findings and try them in a new setting, okay? So this is where rich description comes into play and being precise. And then dependability is where you're focusing on being able to replicate the study. So anybody can read your study and understand how you got to where you got, okay? People probably aren't going to try to replicate it, but they should have a pretty good idea of what you did to get to your data, because everyone tries to do the anything goes in qualitative research, that's why we don't like it, you know, and what it should really be is like, no, you have to be able to show everything that you did, right? So that people can understand where you got from. It's not anything goes, it's just that whatever you did, you have to be able to show it and you have to be able to justify it. Because you might do something that people might say, I don't think that was a good move. So you have to be transparent. Then lastly, confirmability. This is where the findings can be traced back to their sources and we can see how you got to your conclusion. So basically, you have an archive of your data that we can see and that we can go back to if we ever question how you got to your findings. So that's confirmability. We can confirm what you came up with. Okay? So I know this was a bit of a long lecture, but this covers so many foundational things so that next week we can finally delve into quantitative methods and really start hammering that home. If you have any questions, I know some of this was a little bit complex, feel free to ask. Email me, call me, hit me up, and I wish you luck in this week's assignments.